The Davos illusion. When technology meets geopolitics in late January, the world's most powerful political and financial figures once again gathered in the Swiss Alps for the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. As, in previous years, the official agenda was carefully curated. This time, it revolved around artificial intelligence, productivity gains, automation, the next wave of growth, and the promise of a technological transformation that would supposedly define the coming decades. Panels were scheduled, reports were released, and executives arrived prepared to speak about compute power, data centers, and the efficiency frontier. But almost immediately, the meeting was overtaken by something else. Instead of algorithms, the conversations turned to alliances. Instead of productivity, they turned to borders. Instead of the future of work, they turned to the future of power. The reason was not subtle. Donald Trump's return to the center of the geopolitical stage, and the set of strategic positions associated with it in trade, on NATO, on territorial interests, and on economic sovereignty, a reality that Davos has often tried to postpone in periods of systemic transition. Geopolitics always dominates technology, not the other way around. The World Economic Forum is designed to project an image of coordinated global management. It presents the world as a system that can be optimized. Better rules, better technology, better governance. Artificial intelligence fits naturally into this narrative. It promises efficiency without politics, solutions without conflict, and growth without painful restructuring. In this framing, AI is not merely a tool, but a stabilizer, something that can compensate for aging populations, slowing productivity, and rising fiscal stress. Yet this narrative depends on a single fragile assumption, that the global political environment remains fundamentally cooperative and predictable. That assumption is no longer holding. What became visible in Davos was not simply a disagreement over policy, it was a collision between two incompatible worldviews. On one side stands the technocratic vision, a borderless digital economy, integrated supply chains, and globally optimized systems managed by rules and institutions. On the other stands the re-emerging logic of power politics, states prioritizing security, control, and strategic autonomy over efficiency and integration. It is a symptom and an accelerant. The pressure had been building for more than a decade, from the 2008 financial crisis. Through the pandemic, to the fragmentation of trade and the return of industrial policy, what his return represents is the open acknowledgement that the era of frictionless globalization is over, and that political leverage now matters more than economic elegance. History offers a clear pattern here. Every major technological revolution has unfolded inside a geopolitical struggle, not above it. Railways did not unify the world peacefully, they enabled empires. Oil did not simply fuel growth, it reshaped wars and alliances. Nuclear technology did not stabilize politics, it reorganized power. The internet did not dissolve borders, it created new domains of conflict. Artificial intelligence will not be an exception. The reason is structural. Technology changes what is possible, but politics determines what is allowed, what is funded, and what is weaponized. In stable periods, markets and institutions can pretend that efficiency is the primary organizing principle. In unstable periods, states revert to a different hierarchy. Control first, resilience second, efficiency last. This is already visible in financial markets. While the rhetoric in Davos focused on innovation and opportunity, asset prices have become increasingly sensitive to political signals. Trade disputes, sanctions, military tensions, and alliance politics now move markets as much as interest rates or earnings reports. This is not a temporary anomaly. It is the market's way of pricing a more dangerous world. The deeper contradiction is that artificial intelligence is being introduced at the very moment when the political foundations required for its smooth deployment are weakening. AI systems depend on stable energy supplies, predictable trade flows, secure capital markets, and functioning institutions. These are not technological variables, they're political ones, and they are all becoming less stable. The Davos agenda assumes continuity, that the existing global order will persist long enough for technology to gradually improve it, but the signals coming from geopolitics suggest discontinuity instead. A strategic competition between major powers, the erosion of multilateral frameworks, and the renationalization of economic policy are not temporary disruptions. They are signs of a system moving into a more fragmented and contested phase. In such an environment, technology does not act as a neutral force. It becomes an instrument of competition. This is why the attempt to make AI the central theme of Davos was, in a strategic sense, already outdated. The real question facing the global system is not how quickly productivity can be improved, but how the world will be governed as cooperation gives way to rivalry. The real risk is not that AI will arrive too slowly, but that it will arrive in a world that is no longer organized to absorb it peacefully. The first and most important conclusion, then, is a negative one. Artificial intelligence is not entering a stable, rules-based order. It is entering a fractured, debt-laden, and increasingly power-driven world. And in such a world, geopolitics does not adapt to technology. Technology adapts to geopolitics. The debt superstructure and the fragile economic floor beneath the confident language of innovation and transformation that dominates gatherings like Davos. The global economic system rests on a far less discussed foundation: debt.
Not as a temporary instrument, not as a cyclical excess,
but as a structural support without which the current order would no longer function. Over the past 3 decades, debt has quietly replaced productivity as the main stabilizing mechanism of the world economy. In nominal terms, global debt has reached levels that would have seemed implausible at the end of the Cold War. Sovereign states, corporations, and households have all become increasingly dependent on borrowing to sustain growth, consumption, and political stability. What was once justified as counter-cyclical policy has gradually become a permanent condition. The system no longer uses debt to smooth shocks. It uses debt to exist. This shift has profound consequences. At the state level, public borrowing has become the primary way to reconcile to incompatible pressures. Rising social and strategic spending on one side, and political resistance to taxation on the other. At the corporate level, cheap credit has substituted for organic growth, financing share buybacks, acquisitions, and financial engineering rather than productive investment. At the household level, debt has filled the gap between stagnant real incomes and the cost of maintaining middle-class living standards. Together, these 3 layers form what can be called a debt superstructure, a financial architecture that supports asset prices, consumption, and political calm. But only as long as interest rates remain manageable and confidence remains intact. This is where the contradiction with the Davos AI narrative becomes visible. Artificial intelligence is often presented as a solution to the productivity problem. It promises efficiency gains, cost reductions, and new growth engines. But the current economic system is not primarily constrained by productivity. It is constrained by balance sheets. High debt levels impose a form of macroeconomic gravity. They make economies more sensitive to interest rates, or dependent on central bank intervention, and more vulnerable to political shocks. In such a system, stability is not a luxury, it is a necessity. This is why financial markets react so strongly to geopolitical signals. A trade conflict, a sanctions regime, or a military escalation is not just a political event. It is a potential threat to the entire debt structure that underpins asset valuations. When risk premiums rise, borrowing costs rise. When borrowing costs rise, the sustainability of the debt pyramid comes into question. For more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, this fragility was masked by an extraordinary monetary environment. Near-zero interest rates and large-scale asset purchases allowed governments to borrow cheaply, corporations to refinance endlessly, and markets to treat risk as an abstract concept. This was not a return to normality, it was an interlude. That interlude is now ending. Inflation, geopolitical fragmentation, and the remilitarization of economic policy are forcing a repricing of capital. Even modest increases in interest rates have disproportionate effects when debt levels are this high. What would have been manageable in a low-leverage world becomes destabilizing in a high-leverage one. This creates a strategic dilemma that Davos rarely confronts directly. On the one hand, the system needs technological disruption to boost productivity and justify its debt load. On the other hand, technological disruption is inherently destabilizing. It reallocates income, displaces labor, and shifts competitive advantages. The current order cannot easily absorb both financial tightening and technological upheaval at the same time. There is a deeper tension as well. Artificial intelligence is, by its nature, deflationary in many sectors. It reduces labor costs, increases efficiency, and compresses margins. But a highly indebted system is not built to tolerate deflation. It depends on nominal growth to service liabilities and maintain solvency. In other words, the very productivity gains that AI promises are economically ambiguous in a world saturated with debt. This is one reason why asset markets appear disconnected from underlying economic reality. Equity valuations and property prices reflect not so much confidence in long-term growth as confidence in continued financial support. They are priced for a world in which liquidity remains abundant and political risk remains contained. Geopolitics is now challenging both assumptions. When political leaders emphasize strategic autonomy, industrial policy, and economic security, they are implicitly accepting higher costs and lower efficiency. Reshoring supply chains, duplicating production capacity, and restricting trade are rational from a security perspective, but they are inflationary and capital-intensive from an economic one. They also increase the demands on public finances. This is the context in which Trump-style geopolitical bargaining becomes financially significant. It is not about any single policy announcement. It is about the cumulative effect of a world in which economic relationships are increasingly conditional, contested, and weaponized. In such a world, the margin for error is thin. The global economy is no longer a flexible, lightly leveraged system that can easily absorb shocks. It is a tightly wound structure, dependent on confidence, low-risk premiums, and continuous refinancing. Small disturbances propagate quickly. Large disturbances threaten the whole. The central illusion is that technological progress can compensate for financial fragility. In reality, the opposite is more likely. The more leveraged the system becomes, the more it requires political and monetary stability. And the more geopolitics intrudes into economics, the less stable that foundation becomes. The second conclusion, therefore, is more sobering than the first. The world is not only politically fragmenting, it is doing so on top of an economic structure that is already under extreme financial strain. And this means that the coming technological transition will not take place on solid ground. It will take place on a floor that is already cracking. The return of power politics and the end of the rules-based illusion for more than 3 decades. The global system operated under explains that were so familiar, they gradually became invisible. The Cold War ended. The United States stood as the central stabilizing power. An economic integration expanded under the assumption that politics would slowly become subordinate to markets. Trade would deepen, institutions would strengthen, and conflict would be managed through rules rather than force. This period is now ending. What is dissolving is not merely a set of policies, but an entire organizing principle. The so-called rules-based international order was never simply a legal framework. It was a power structure sustained by 4 conditions: overwhelming American strategic dominance, cheap and abundant energy, low inflation and cheap capital, and continuously expanding globalization. All 4 of these conditions have now reversed. American relative power is no longer uncontested. Energy is once again a strategic weapon. Inflation has returned as a structural variable. And globalization is fragmenting into rival economic blocs. In such an environment, the language of universal rules loses its practical meaning. What remains is the older logic of international politics, states competing for security, influence, and strategic depth. The focus on Greenland, the transactional approach to NATO, use of tariffs and industrial policy, and the emphasis on national leverage are not historical anomalies. They are expressions of a broader shift in how major powers now think about the world. The priority is no longer optimization. It is positioning. This change is visible far beyond the United States. China has been preparing for strategic self-sufficiency for more than a decade. Europe is reluctantly rediscovering the language of defense and industrial policy. Middle powers are hedging, diversifying alliances, and seeking autonomy in critical sectors. Even traditionally neutral states are rethinking their assumptions. What unites these responses is a common recognition. Interdependence is no longer seen as a pure asset. It is seen as a vulnerability. The economic system is being reorganized around a new hierarchy of goals. Where efficiency once dominated, it is now subordinated to security. Where cost minimization once drove supply chains, resilience and control now take precedence. Where capital once flowed primarily in search of returns, it increasingly flows in search of political safety. This is not a cyclical adjustment, it is a structural one. The decline of democratic legitimacy in many parts of the world is both a cause and a consequence of this shift. When economic systems fail to deliver broad-based prosperity and stability, political systems lose credibility. The result is the rise of populist movements, stronger executives, and a greater tolerance for exceptional measures. This, in turn, feeds back into geopolitics. States with weaker internal legitimacy tend to rely more on external confrontation, symbolic victories, and strategic posturing. The boundary between domestic politics and foreign policy becomes thinner. From a strategic perspective, this creates a world that is more volatile, not less. Great power competition has a well-established historical pattern. It does not prioritize economic efficiency. It prioritizes control over critical resources, technologies, and routes. Redundancy replaces specialization. Stockpiles replace just-in-time logistics. Influence operations replace multilateral consensus. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, energy systems, and rare earths are not treated as normal industries in this environment. They are treated as strategic assets. The implications for the global economy are profound. A system optimized for speed and cost is being reconfigured for durability and autonomy. This is inherently more expensive. It requires more capital, more duplication, and more political coordination. It also means more friction. Trade disputes, sanctions regimes, export controls, and investment screening are no longer exceptional tools. They are becoming permanent features of the landscape. The distinction between economic policy and security policy is fading. This is the world that Davos is struggling to fully acknowledge. The forum's language remains anchored in the assumptions of the previous era: cooperation, coordination, and global solutions. But the actual behavior of states is increasingly driven by a different logic: competition, contingency planning, and strategic insulation. The phrase rules-based order continues to be used, but more as a rhetorical reference than as an accurate description of how power is now exercised. In reality, the system is moving towards something older and more familiar: a balance of power world, but one layered on top of an intensely interconnected and financially leveraged global economy. This combination is historically unusual and inherently unstable. In such a setting, technological progress does not float above politics. It is absorbed into it, becomes a tool of state strategy. Standards become instruments of influence. Infrastructure becomes a geopolitical bargaining chip. The central question is no longer who can produce the most efficiently, but who can deny critical capabilities to rivals, and who can survive if those capabilities are denied in return. The third conclusion follows directly. The global system is no longer organized around mutual optimization. It is reorganizing around mutual suspicion. And once that threshold is crossed, the idea that any technology, no matter how powerful, can operate in a politically neutral space becomes increasingly implausible. The world that is taking shape is not post-geopolitical. It is more geopolitical than the world it is replacing. At Davos, artificial intelligence is often presented not just as a new technology, but as a kind of macroeconomic remedy. It is expected to lift productivity, offset demographic decline, stabilize public finances, and restore a sense of forward momentum to a system that has been relying on debt and monetary intervention for far too long. In this narrative, AI is not merely a tool. It is the bridge back to sustainable growth. This expectation rests on a critical misunderstanding. Technology does not operate in a vacuum. It operates inside political, financial, and institutional systems. And those systems are now becoming more constrained, more fragmented, and more conflict-driven. There is a fundamental difference between technological capability and systemic deployability. A model can exist in a laboratory. A prototype can function in a controlled environment. But to reshape an economy at scale, A technology requires stable energy supplies, predictable trade relationships, deep and liquid capital markets, reliable legal frameworks, and long planning horizons. All of these are becoming less reliable. Advanced artificial intelligence is among the most infrastructure-intensive technologies ever developed. It depends on enormous amounts of electricity, highly specialized hardware, globally distributed supply chains, and continuous capital expenditure. It is not a lightweight digital overlay. It is a heavy industrial system disguised as software. This alone makes it sensitive to geopolitical disruption, a world of sanctions, export controls, shipping constraints, and strategic stockpiling is not a world optimized for the rapid and efficient diffusion of such a technology. It is a world in which access is uneven, duplication is costly, and delays are normal. The emerging reality is not a single global AI ecosystem. It is a bifurcated and possibly tripler one. A Western stack, a Chinese stack, a set of partially aligned or non-aligned systems around them. Each will have its own standards, its own supply chains, its own regulatory assumptions, and its own strategic priorities. This fragmentation has two major consequences. First, it reduces the aggregate efficiency gains that AI can deliver. Redundancy, incompatibility, and restricted exchange all impose costs. The productivity dividend that Davos hopes for becomes smaller and slower. Second, it transforms AI from a general-purpose economic tool into a strategic asset. In such an environment, advanced computing is not primarily deployed where it is most economically efficient. It is deployed where it is most strategically useful. So that means defense, intelligence, surveillance, cyber operations, and industrial control systems rise to the top of the priority list. This is already visible in government funding patterns and regulatory debates. The language of national security is increasingly attached to data centers, chips, cloud infrastructure, and even basic research. The boundary between civilian and military technology, which was always porous, is becoming thinner still. This changes the economic character of AI. Instead of acting as a broad-based productivity enhancer, it increasingly acts as a force multiplier in power competition. It improves the effectiveness of states and large organizations before it improves the living standards of societies. There is another, more subtle contradiction. Highly indebted and politically strained systems are not good at absorbing rapid structural change. AI, if deployed at scale, will disrupt labor markets, reorganize entire sectors, and concentrate advantages in certain firms and regions. In a stable and confident society, this kind of disruption can be managed through policy and redistribution. In a fragmented and distrustful one, it becomes a source of political stress. Governments that are already struggling with legitimacy, fiscal constraints, and social polarization will find it difficult to navigate large-scale technological displacement. The temptation will be to slow deployment, regulate heavily, or channel it narrowly into politically safer domains. This further limits the growth impact. There is also the monetary dimension. As noted earlier, AI is deflationary in many of its effects, compresses costs and increases efficiency. But the current global system, weighed down by debt, requires nominal growth and moderate inflation to remain stable. This creates a structural mismatch. A technology that is economically beneficial in isolation can be financially destabilizing in context. The final irony is that AI may end up strengthening the very forces that are fragmenting the world. It enhances surveillance capabilities. It improves information warfare. It accelerates decision cycles in military and financial systems. It makes states more capable of monitoring, predicting, and influencing both their own populations and their rivals. In other words, it deepens the logic of strategic competition. The hope that artificial intelligence will act as a neutral, pacifying force is not supported by historical experience. Major technologies do not dissolve power struggles. They reorganize them. The world is not choosing between geopolitics and technology. It is integrating the two. The fourth conclusion, therefore, is clear. Artificial intelligence will not stabilize a fragmenting world order. It will operate inside that fragmentation, and in many cases, intensify it. It may make states more capable, will not make the system more cooperative, and it will not reverse the deeper political and financial forces that are already reshaping the global landscape. It will simply become part of how that reshaping is carried out. If you've been around long enough to remember when the world felt simpler, more predictable, then you already know why this story matters. If you haven't subscribed yet, think of it as keeping a front row seat to history before it becomes a footnote.